I am having computer issues, so sorry I'm running just a couple of minutes late. Let me get my act together here. Come on, laptop, you can do it. All right, let's see. That's where we need to be. Okay, let's see, who's first up on my screen? Catherine, can you see that? Is that PowerPoint visible? Yeah, okay. I think my laptop's decided to go on an early spring refresh. I'm quite sure what's going on. Okay, let's get started. Good morning. Thanks, everybody. 1 minute late, my bad. All right, so we've got a few things to wrap up here. I want to spend, let's see, maybe 20 or so minutes, maybe half of the lecture this morning, finishing the material on population. We've got a couple of very important concepts to tie in. And one of the most important is food. So I need to make that link. Then we'll put that to rest. And then we start chapter 3, and this is a big chunk of material, and will take us up to the exam. And then again, as always, after the lecture this morning, I'll hang around for as long as need be to see if there are any questions or if you have any logistical issues so far. Okay, so we ended off here, and so we've been beginning to pull some of the population material here into a regional and also a global context. And this slide, if you remember, looked at the importance of migration, immigration. And I made the point here that countries that have been taking large numbers of people are generally those that are, high income countries, high GDP, wealthier countries, and those that are losing populations less so. But there's some interesting nuances to this, right? And I made the point that obviously refugees are one component of that. So from Syria, losing millions of people going into nearby countries like Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey, for example. So that's an interesting, nuance to this. But that was kind of the take home from that. Now, someone asked me about this in terms of population. And this is, of course, one way to control population, right? This relates to China's one-child policy. I don't necessarily want to get into a debate, so to speak, on the ethics and the morals of a one-child policy, other than to say in 1979, this policy was put in place by the government in China to begin to limit population growth. They realized that a rapidly and ongoing expanding population would have significant implications for resources and for the economic development of the country. Again, some people would find this, enormously problematic on a number of different grounds. I think what's really interesting is that when you actually look at China and sort of try and decide whether the one-child policy was successful or not, whether you agree with it or not, this diagram shows changes in fertility rate, right? Not just in China, but it's dominated by China. You can see that all through the 1950s and 1960s, the total fertility rates were way up there in the 5.5 to 6, right? That's catastrophically high growth. The one-child policy in China goes in right here, in about right at 1979, and you can see it up here on this graph as a little inset here. 1979, the one-child policy goes into play. Interesting question, Courtney. I'll get to that in just a sec. So the one thing you can see here is that the total fertility rates in China were already on a significant decline, right, prior to the actual one-child policy going in. So Courtney's question is, what happens if someone in China gets pregnant with a second child? Now that's not an issue because the one-child policy ended. Was it officially last year or just at the end of 2019? So that policy ended. But to get to your point, Courtney, what happens is that there were significant fines and tax implications for education and so on if you had more than one child, right? The the ramifications of this. Oh, Sandy, interesting comment here, right? Isn't there now more men of marrying age now that there are women because of this? Absolutely, right? The ramifications of the one-child policy have actually been quite profound in terms of the distribution of sexes, right? And linked to that, infanticide, people wanting to have boys. It's had all sorts of complicated knock-on effects, again, which would move into a discussion perhaps on the morality of a one-child policy. But functionally, just from a demographic and an environmental perspective, you can see the total fertility rates on a significant decline, right? Before that one-child policy was put in. And, and now it is, to me anyway, it's fascinating that, China's total fertility rate has now dropped below the replacement rate. And so with a population of about 1.4 billion-ish, now China by 2050 will no longer be the most populous country, right? That's going to be going down to about 1.2 to 1.25. So successful, yes, but just as one example, right? Thanks for those two questions. Good questions. Okay, now I want to go across here. I'm going to stop the share and go across to a website here. So just bear with me for a moment. I know this just takes a moment. Okay, so that's the website. And I want to get on and share this website because I think this is just cool when we put it into motion. All right, so here we go. Okay, everybody there? You should be able to see a website. Catherine, you're my guinea pig this morning because you're first up.
Yes, I see it.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. All right. So this is just awesome and cool, right? So this is a website called Gapminder, and I'm going to use this to show you or to try and illustrate, make the point that things are improving, right? It's very easy, perhaps, to become a doom and gloom person when it comes to environmental issues. And I've made that point when we first got together, right? I don't have any interest in 15 weeks of, Linus dragging around his blanket and all gloomy and everything's bad, because it's not. So here's what I'm going to show you. And we could have chosen any number of examples, but I want to put this in motion. I hope it annotates. As I click it, Catherine, if things don't move, just shout and I'll try and fix it, right? But what you're looking at here is an axis. So this is from Gapminder, and it's a really neat website. And it's a website that was developed to make sense of complicated statistics and data. So on the y-axis here, you've got life expectancy, right? And on the bottom axis, you've got income, okay? And the income there is basically, a levelized GDP. Okay, so it's per person GDP per capita. So $250, 4,000, 8,000, 16. So it's a logarithmic scale on the bottom, right? I've highlighted 7 countries here, and the countries are color coordinated. So red in the top right of the diagram, I hope you can all see that, is South Asia and Southeast Asia, including Australia, right? Blue is Sub-Saharan Africa, green is Northern Africa and the Middle East, orange is Europe and Russia, yellows are the Americas. And we're going to look at 8 countries here. The data, so this starts in 1800, and of course the data as you go back to 1800, becomes a little fuzzier. So for the early part, just let it run out and watch what happens to these countries as I put it in motion. So I'm going to put it in motion. As it goes in motion, Catherine, if you wouldn't mind just putting your thumb up if it's moving. Thank you. Beautiful. All right. So see what happens here, right? This is kind of like a horse race. So there's unknown data, right? All of these little dots are countries. The size of the dot represents the population of the country. So we're moving into the 1850s here, the 1860s. There's China in red. Here's India in blue, India and Bangladesh, Ethiopia on the left-hand side in light blue. Not much data going on there. Let's stop it right at 1900, right? Now, 1900, we're starting to see the United States begin to take off here, okay? We're starting to see life expectancy increasing, and we're seeing the United States becoming richer. Look at the life expectancy numbers here, everybody. In the United States, it was estimated to be about 50 years old, right? Back in China and India, life expectancy less than 30. So you can imagine what will happen here. World War I, we see a dip. There it goes. Now we come out of World War I, the roaring 20s, the depression. We're moving towards World War II. World War II, a dip, as we see. Now we start moving into the Great Acceleration, right? That post-1950 stuff we talked about at the outset. But now look what happens. Look what happens to China and to Bangladesh and to India and Ethiopia. And look how quickly Japan comes out of the World War II era, right? And here comes China coming around the corner, and we are off. One-child policy goes in place. Look at China at the top. Japan outstripping the United States in terms of life expectancy. There goes Japan, Bangladesh, India, Ethiopia. Here we go, 2020. That is remarkable, right? When you see these countries, the shift from the bottom left to the top right, right? Countries becoming wealthier and living longer. There's lots of interesting subtlety here, right? The subtlety, for example, when you look at Mexico, goes back up here and it gets, so this is Mexico going through the financial crisis of the 1980s, right? But when you look at you look at a country like India over here, India has a GDP in 2020 of $7,360, right? And a life expectancy of almost 70 as health and human services have improved, right? In India, that's the same as what the United States was in the 1920s, as things really begin to ramp up. Does that make sense, what everybody's looking at here? Okay. So here's another one. Let's see, do I need to reshare that or did that change, Catherine? Sorry to keep picking on you.
It looks good.
Okay, thank you. So here's another one, right? Another way to look at this, just in terms of demographic. Child mortality on the left axis, okay? And total fertility rate child mortality on the y-axis on the left here, and total fertility, TFR, babies per woman on the left axis, and we'll put this in motion and see the same thing, right? So total fertility rates, we'll let it run from the early 1800s, and again, the horizontal lines just mean, well, we're not quite sure what that data looks like, okay? So we look at the United States here, we're not quite sure, no real good data, but now we come into 1900, right? So the 1900s start here, right about here. So child mortality is coming down, total fertility rates are starting to come down. Let me just pause that there, 1927. Here is India in 1927, the total fertility rate of 5.82, okay? So we go into approaching World War II, right? And here we come out of World War II. Now the great acceleration. Just watch all these circles go from top right, high fertility rates and high infant mortality. And now as we move into the 80s and 90s, you see this dramatic shift, right? Down towards the bottom left-hand here, as infant mortality drops and total fertility rates drop. Does everybody see that? That's what I mean by this remarkable shift in the world getting healthier and getting wealthier. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions on that before we go back to the PowerPoint. I will put up, just incidentally, you'll get to look at Gapminder in lab, and I'll put up these, animations so you can look at them in your own time. Okay, so those were just the static diagrams of Gapminder. Okay. I added a couple of slides here. I'll upload these as well. It's no big deal. It doesn't change anything, but I wanted to put these up here because I think they show a couple of really interesting things, right? So here's number one. It shows how the world's middle class is expanding, okay? We're seeing, so poverty is defined by the World Bank essentially as anyone living on less than $1.90 a day. Right? And what we're seeing here at a population of about 3.7 billion is just how many people are migrating towards the middle classes. Again, getting wealthier for sure. Now, regionally, this plays out very differently, right? The middle class is exploding in Asia, and it's beginning to really develop significantly in countries like Mexico and South America, but lagging behind dramatically in other parts of the world, including Africa. So currently, when you look at this, right, this is the current situation of more or less how the world is distributed across here. We've seen in the last 5 years, so along the bottom part of the axis here, you'll see in light gray, in the last 5 years, 150 million people have come out of poverty, right? We would clearly want more people to move from the left-hand side to the right-hand side here, okay? Vulnerable are people that are economically and socioeconomically vulnerable, but clearly the world is moving towards a wealthier state. Now, how that pans out in terms of food and the environment is something that we're still going to explore in the course for sure. So this is a quick summary then of, I think, the key factors as to why we're seeing such a significant reduction in total fertility rate, right? Children are surviving, okay? 100 years ago, infant mortality is so high that families have large numbers of children to keep that lineage going, right? So infant mortality is dropping. As I said, we're moving towards an industrialized, economic, technologically advanced situation where we don't need lots of kids to run farms, okay? Critically, and several of you pointed this out, women are getting educated and joining the labor force, and family planning is becoming accessible. All of those things, I think, are, they are fantastic news, right, in terms of reducing total fertility rates and giving us, I think, a real sense of hope that we may well top out at something between 10 to 10.5 billion or so people by the end of the century. That doesn't mean that we don't have hugely significant challenges ahead of us, because these people are going to want food and seek carbon and energy and so on, right? So let me just stop there and see if there are any comments or thoughts or questions on that, just in terms of demographics, before I talk a little bit about food. All good. Okay, cool. I finally figured out how to put all your faces on a separate screen. I've been doing this for like a year, and I've had you all scrunched up in the bottom right, so now I can see you better. Okay, all right, so let's end off chapter 2 here with food and make this link between population and food. And then, agriculture obviously has an enormous impact on the carbon cycle, which we'll come to, but I wanted to just, it would be a huge disservice not obviously to talk about food. And in fact, I should probably do an entire chapter of food. But here's one of these startling statistics, right? That 1 in 7 people go to bed hungry at night. And I don't mean like mildly peckish, oh, I could do with a meal. I mean, seriously hungry. And a large number go to bed seriously hungry here in the United States. It's really a humanitarian catastrophe, okay? And I think the tragedy for me, this is just my opinion, you're obviously welcome to disagree. The tragedy is that this just does not have to be, right? We currently produce, I think the consensus is, we currently produce enough food to feed the world. The supply chain, the distribution, the organization, the corruption along the supply chain is often what gets in the way, right? So that's just at the outset. Okay, one of these general maps that I just love, and this is, I think, really instructive in terms of the environment for sure. I'm going to change colors here so it doesn't clash. So this shows land use designated as global percentage of either area under croplands, right? So that doesn't have to be, we're not talking necessarily about large mechanized agriculture like you'll see in the United States. This could also be small scale subsistence farming, but basically crops versus land that is set aside for pasture, okay? A fabulous diagram. Obviously there are some areas here like, Greenland, ice is not included here. And we have the great deserts of the world, right, that are not included. So it shows areas that are just currently under cropland and pasture. So what's your take home from this? Someone give me a launching point for a bit of a discussion here. What dominates? What do you see? Maybe something surprises you. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe this is kind of what you expected. Gavin.
I did see that it was that intense in like Asia. Like there's a lot like concentration like right there.
Right.
In terms of pasture.
One of my favorite countries, India, massively agricultural. Okay, no pasture in India, right? Because cows are sacred and they don't eat meat. But look at Asia, right? Parts of India here, massive agriculture. Enormous pastures across places like Mongolia. Mongolia is such an interesting one. You'll see later on much later on when we start doing footprinting. I know you're doing that in lab this week, but when we wrap this course up and look at ecological footprinting, you'll see how Mongolia plays out in terms of that. Let's just see, there's a quick thing on the chat. Yeah, so that's the bottom line, Sonny, right? Pasture land is greater than cropland, significantly so. If you're going to remember any number here, just for the moment, that's a useful one to remember. About 1.6, 1.5 billion hectares of land is set aside for cropland. And incidentally, a hectare is 100 meters by 100 meters, right? What does that look like? Well, if you're a football fan like me, it looks like 2 Amon Carter stadiums, the grass, right? Take away the end zones. So 2 Amon Carter stadiums, that's what a hectare is. But you can see clearly how dominant the surface of the earth is to pasture, right? To raising sheep and cattle and things like that. Pretty extraordinary. When I first started getting into this, Gavin, I was in the same boat. I thought it was pretty much evenly distributed, but it's not, right? Okay. Yeah, interesting comments. And if everyone in the yard grew crops instead of grass, there would be much more food and less water wasted to grow the grass. And to take that one further, if no one ate meat, we would be in a very different situation, right? In terms of getting energy from the sunlight directly into the human body, okay? Question, what does the yellow 0% mean? Where am I seeing the yellow 0%? Oh, the top left, that just means it's neither. Then that just means it's neither cropland or pasture, right? That would be urban areas or ice or deserts, something like that, if that makes sense. Okay, so Sandy, let me take you one step further along your comment here. I think this may speak to it because it's an interesting and important comment, right? This is an infographic. I don't know if this works or not. Let's see if it works for you, but it's an infographic that makes one point, okay? And the point is that cows are very, very expensive, okay? So what I mean by that is this. On the left-hand side here, this is our agricultural land. So if we take the previous map, right? So we take that previous map of cropland and pasture, and we spread that out and say, okay, that's all of our agriculture, right? How much of it is in grazing land? 70%, right? That's the 3.5 billion hectares. How much of it is in cropland? About 30%, right? So when we take that red and green, that's what it looks like. So the red on the previous diagram would be about 70%, and the cropland would be about 30%, right? So clearly, our land use from an agricultural perspective is dominated by grazing. The next thing down is this. Let me circle this here, right? So this is the energy in those two crops, right, represented as the percentage of the biomass, right? Now, biomass is just simply the weight of the biologic material. So sunlight comes in and creates energy. That's photosynthesis, right? So sunlight in photosynthesis grows plants and creates energy, right? That is the most efficient way of getting calories and energy into a human body, right? Is by eating vegetation. Why? Because you lose, quote unquote, you lose so much energy up the chain by growing animals, right? So sunlight creates all this grass, right? And Sandy, you're right, we've got to water the grass, and then we've got to grow these creatures, and we've got to grow these creatures. Oh, and by the way, this here, this part of the cropland is used to grow feed for these folks, right? So it's not that the cows are just grazing on the pasture, on the grass. We're also growing corn for feed for animals, if that makes sense, right? So the thing that is just remarkable, and I hope this doesn't confuse, but when you look at the amount of food that we grow, right? So we've got crops and pasture or anything. Cows represent, now this is globally, about 86% of all of that biomass. Yet cows supply 8% of the food. Wait a minute. What's wrong with that picture, right? If we've got plant foods here, right, producing that, and cows produce so little, there is such an enormous loss of energy up the chain, right? If that makes sense. Now, again, just in terms of transparency here, I'm not a vegetarian, right? And I'm absolutely not trying to preach to become a vegetarian. Environmentally, I should be, but I'm not. That's just my reality, and it is what it is, as they say, okay? But in terms of if we're trying to feed the people, if we're trying to feed humanity, the bottom line is less of this and more of that. Does that make sense? Let me see if there are any questions or thoughts on there, right?
I have a question.
Yeah, fire away, Holly.
You know how we talked about that? I don't remember what the concept was, but it was like where the moose and wolves had like their own, but like if one died off, the other one
Yeah,
boomed.
carrying capacity and overshoot and all that.
Yes, that. What if that would that happen with cows if like our civilization stopped eating them? Would they like just kind of go into like this boom? I don't know. It was just I thought that.
Well, that's an interesting one. You know, probably, but there would be some sort of limit in carrying capacity on that, right? I mean, so they're enormously domesticated, right? So there's a difference between domestication and what happens in the wild, but that's an interesting one. The question from Sharudi is an interesting one, but does more crops mean food for everyone, especially if the distribution is still not efficient? That's a really interesting point. No, it doesn't, right? More crops doesn't necessarily mean food for everyone. And as we'll see when we get to the next set of the next chapter, right? We're taking a big chunk of what's going on here in cropland and putting it into our vehicles, right? We're growing corn to produce ethanol. Why are we doing that, right? Shouldn't we be growing corn to feed human beings rather than taking corn and putting it into ethanol? So it's a really interesting point and an astute observation that more crops doesn't necessarily mean more food. My point simply is more crops means a greater opportunity to get more calories into human beings, if that makes sense. Did that answer your question, Sharudi? I hope it did. Shout if it didn't, right? So here's kind of the summary infographic, right? In terms of food, okay? Creating a sustainable food future. And I know I'm doing food an enormous injustice here by just, spending 20 minutes on it, right? But here's kind of the take home, the summary, I think, of this before I get to a scenario and then end it, right? The question is, if we're going to get 10 billion people by, say, 2050, I know we've talked about 9.7 by 2050, and we've talked about 10.9 by 2100. Let's just round it up to 10 and say those Lego blocks are correct, right? And we're going to have 10 billion. How are we going to feed 10 billion people? Now, the estimates of how much more food we will need vary tremendously, right? Some publications say we're going to have to double food production. Some say that's not true, okay? This number here, I'm personally very comfortable with. This comes from the United Nations Food and Agriculture, the World Bank, and several other institutes working on population and food projections. I think this is reasonable, right? I think we're probably going to have to increase our food production worldwide by about 50%, right? More or less. Interesting question, Anthony. I'll come back to that in a second, right? So let's just say we're going to have to produce 50% more food to feed 10 billion people, okay? We're going to need to do that without using more land, okay? Can we do that without using more land? In other words, if we need to increase our food production by 50%, where are we going to find that land? Okay. Is there all that land just sitting out there waiting to be plowed? The answer is no, there isn't, right? We are absolutely maxed and tapped out in terms of agricultural land. Now we can go into the tropical forests of the world. That's chapter 7 that we have to talk about, right? How do we do that? We may need to put, right, another 600 million hectares into production. That's no big deal. That's just twice the size of India, okay? Where's that land going to be, right? So without trying to sound kind of, silly about it, it's an enormous challenge, right, on how to do this. And this is the diagram that I want to end on. So I came up with this diagram to try and just show you what the scale of the challenge is. And if I was you, I would bet you're going to see this diagram sometime in middle February on exam number 1, right? So let me explain what's going on here. It shows the human dependency on land and the challenge that we have. And there are three vertical axes here, just to make it bizarre and wacky, right? Okay, so let me finish this and then I'll come back to the chat. So we've got here cropland on this axis, so how many billion hectares? So this is 1.65 billion hectares of cropland. And remember, I said if it's one number you're going to remember, that's it. That's the 2019 area under cropland, 1.56 billion hectares, right? So this curve here shows the amount of land that's gone into cropland, not pasture, but cropland, up until 2019, okay? And it relates to this axis here. So I hope everybody's clear on that. Then we've got an easy one, population, billions of people, so that works. And then we've got one divided by the other on the other side here. This is the arable land per capita, the hectares per capita, right? So this is just simply taking how much land there is, dividing it by the population. So what's going on here? So here are the things that are known. See if I can change back to a color that doesn't clash. So this shows population over time, right? So we've got, this is population growth, this green curve, up to 2019, okay? This is the growth in arable land. You can see there hasn't really been a whole lot of change here for the last 25 or so years. And this shows the decrease in arable land per person. Does that make sense to everybody, right? If you're keeping the amount of arable land the same and you're growing the population, the amount of arable land per person has to come down. So here it is about, you know, let's just round it up to about 0.2 hectares per person. So what does that mean? That means that if you take 2 Amon Carter fields, right, about 20% of that, or if you took 1 Amon Carter field, that would be the equivalent of going from the 0-yard line to the 40-yard line, right? That's about how much arable land there is per person on the planet, okay? Now what's going to happen moving through to 2050 and beyond? Well, we've already said we're almost certainly going to add another 2 billion people up here to get it to say 9.7 billion people, right? So we're certain that the population is going to grow. And if the amount of arable land stays the same, then only one thing can go down, and that's the amount of arable land per person, right? So what I'm saying is this: if we keep the amount of arable land flat, in other words, if we say we're not going to plow under any more land, we're not going to go into the tropical forest, we're not going to plow up the permafrost, we're not going to go and plow up Greenland, okay? So keep the amount of arable land for crops at 1.5 billion hectares. And we know that the population is going to go up to about 9.7 billion people. The only thing that will go down is that instead of having from 0 to 40 yards on the Amon Carter field, we're going to have from 0 to 20 yards, right? If that makes sense. We're going to have about 0.1 hectares per person. Or we could simply say, no, you know what, let's keep it at 0.2 hectares per person, and then let's just suddenly put more and more land under the plow, right? So there were a couple, before I ask, there were a couple of questions here. Sandy, large amounts of leafy vegetables can be grown in a little space, and hydroponics, yeah, could hydroponic systems. So that's really interesting. Not everything is about the plow and putting fields under arable land, right? There's a lot of work being done on aquaponics, okay, hydroponics, vertical farming, urban farming, and so on, right? All of those things are important. The challenge, though, and the two questions, one came from Anthony and one came from Sandy, I think they're both related to one another. The challenge, like a lot of things in this course, is scale, right? How do we scale that up? How do we scale up hydroponics to the point that, I mean, obviously, from an energy perspective, it's much better to get, you know, calories directly from vegetation into human beings. But, you know, when you've got 1 billion people that are hungry, hydroponics present a challenge, if that makes sense, right? Courtney, interesting question. Should there be restrictions on how much land any one person can buy, similar to how China reduces the amount of children a person could have? I don't know, right? That starts getting into this whole freedom thing. Okay, sorry, you can only have 1 hectare. Texas ranchers may have a problem with that, right? I want more than 1 hectare. So tricky. Any other thoughts or comments, right? The tragedy of the commons, right? The fact, and again, folks, you know, my goal here is not in any way to cast guilt or anything like that. We live in a remarkably privileged society here in the US. We're not just part of that growing middle class, we're part of the high income countries. It's not that that's good or bad, all right? But there's a reality that so many people go to bed hungry at night in our own backyard and around the world. And that's the tragedy that we have to solve, and we have to solve it quickly. And I'm going to leave it there before I go on to just set some seeds for energy. So let's stop there and see what thoughts or comments or questions you have. Anything else on food or population? You're going to see that diagram again. Oh, yes, you are. All good. All good, all good. All right, so let me stop that. And let me go back into, give me 1 second. I just want to close that one down and, oh, yep, yes, we are, we're all good. Okay, I know this Zoom sharing can get a bit awkward, especially if it won't show me where the PowerPoint is. So there it is. And here it is. All right, everybody. Okay. So we are going to move into energy. Now, so for the next 10 minutes, I'm just going to give you some context, right? So set the scene. Again, so much of this is interrelated, right? Interesting point, Kevin. I'm going to move on and we'll come back and we can talk about that when I'm finished in just about 10 minutes. But the one point here again, it seems so obvious, right? So much of this is tied in together, right? Energy, people, land, water, soils, all of this. But let's talk about energy, right? Because energy has such a dramatic impact on our planet from a carbon perspective, from a number of different perspectives. And I'm going to phrase 2 questions here just to get you thinking. Right? And I'm going to assure you, this is not going to be 4 sessions that fossil fuels are bad and renewables are great, and we have to shut down the fossil fuel industry, right? And what I'm going to try and do over the next 3 or 4 sessions is try and give you a real honest look at what our options are, right? The good, the bad, and the ugly. Because the reality, everybody, is that every time you flip on a switch, right? It all comes at a price, not just a price in terms of how much you pay per cents per kilowatt hour, but a price to the environment. Every single thing we do has an impact. But the 2 questions are we destroying the planet in order to save the climate? And I phrase it like that because a lot of what we discuss and what you hear around renewables, like wind and solar, is built around this concept of getting off fossil fuels to reduce carbon to save the planet, to save the climate, right? But what are the environmental implications of that? And the other one is, can we really abandon fossil fuels, right? Any thoughts? Anybody want to give me a nice summary of those 2 questions so we can put it in an op-ed and send it to the New York Times, right? Or how viable are renewables? This beautiful photograph of all these magical windmills, right? These turbines, as they're more correctly called, okay? Is it realistic in a year's time to have all of our electricity powered by wind? Right? Faith, question.
I just had a question. Are those actually efficient? Because I've heard that they don't really do anything compared to the energy that it takes to, put them up and.
Okay, so I am really glad you phrased it like that, right? Because I hear that a lot. Okay, I hear that a lot. So I hear it no matter what you look at, right? So you look at a wind farm and you'll hear that they're inefficient, they're noisy, they're ugly. Some people even suggest they cause cancer. Okay, without getting political, we've heard that in the last few years. Okay, the flip side of that is people will say, okay, hydraulic fracking, right? You've heard of that. We take natural gas out of the ground. It's terrible. It pollutes groundwater. Okay? Coal is awful. It creates black lung disease. Oil, terrible. Birds in the ocean get covered in pollution, right? Solar panels, awful. They have lots of rare earth minerals and they change climate and they're killing the desert tortoise. It goes on and on and on. to get to your point, Faith, that's what we're going to explore in the next 3.5 lectures, right? We're going to explore what is realistic and what is, so you used the term efficient, right? We're going to talk about efficiency. I don't want to answer it right now because we're going to have to look at that, okay? How do we line it all up? If we were to line up a coal-fired power plant and a natural gas plant and an oil, gasoline factory and a wind turbine, a geothermal plant, a nuclear power plant, a solar plant, a hydroelectric power station, how do we balance it, right? How do we evaluate it? I'm not answering your question, Faith. I'm not trying to sidestep you because we're going to get there. I'm going to ask you to answer that yourself in about 3 lectures time. The joys of being a professor and punting, but I'm doing it on purpose, right? Any other questions? Okay, Holly, isn't it cheaper now? Yeah, economics, right? We're going to talk about economics a little bit, including the environment. A very, very good friend of mine is the CEO of one of the largest utility companies the largest utility company, one of the largest in the United States, and actually one of the largest in the world. And he says this is all driven by economics, right? When the market dictates that a technology is cheaper than another one, that's where we will go. You can have all the regulation you want, right? Which is clearly important. I'm not saying we should have a free market with no environmental regulation at all. But when the market drives something, that's where we go. So your question, wind, isn't it cheaper now? I'll answer that one. Yes, it is, right? Wind is as cheap as almost every other way to generate electricity, okay? 10 years ago when I was involved and had a large research grant on wind, and that's why I'm a little less dangerous talking about wind because I think I know a thing or two about it. It wasn't, right? It wasn't cheaper. We had to have huge subsidies to make wind accessible, right? But it is cheaper now. But the oil and gas industry won't believe you, right? Just like the environmentalists won't believe you that fracking can be done relatively safely, okay? So what I'm getting at here, everybody, is that we really, when it comes to energy, we really, really have to try and put those preconceived notions and the biases aside and try and get down to what does the science really tell us about energy and where we need to get it from, okay? If that makes sense to everybody. Gavin, do you want to just expand upon your question for a second?
I don't know like the difference between like the emission of like a fossil fuel versus like, like a corn based like fuel for your car. Like, I don't know if there is a big difference, but I just know that, to really turn fossil fuels into what we want, it's like a lot more emission than it would be for, let's say, I take the corn off the field, which requires like little to no emission to manufacturing into actual fuel. Like there's like there's a difference.
Yeah. No, I see what you're doing. So that's a very difficult one to quantify, right? Because a lot of the environmental impact of energy is just couched within emissions. So you look at this picture again, right? How much carbon dioxide has been emitted into the air here? None, nothing, right? It doesn't mean to say there wasn't carbon generated in producing these wind turbines. They had to be manufactured, they had to be transported, right? So yes, there's a carbon footprint, and that's true with every technology. So what we have to look at is we have to look at what is called the life cycle emissions, right? Life cycle means from getting it out of the ground to getting an electron, into your home. Does that make sense, Gavin? Right? And that's a very difficult thing to do, right? It's the same as the costs, right? What is the actual cost of producing a kilowatt from wind versus nuclear power? It's extremely difficult to quantify, right? Because nuclear power is, I can tell you right now, nuclear power is by far and away the biggest bang for your buck. You cannot beat nuclear power in terms of generating electricity, okay? You can't, not possible. But ... There's a caveat there, right? And the caveat comes to, well, when the nuclear power plant has gone through its life cycle, which at maximum is 80 years, and we'll talk about that, then you have to dismantle it, and those costs are exorbitant, let alone, the risks associated with nuclear power. So what I'm getting at, and thanks for your question, Gavin, what I'm getting at is that there are a lot of moving parts here, so I have to be very specific when it comes to energy. I'm gonna introduce you to the major sources. We're going to look at hopefully the good, the bad, and the ugly. We're going to obviously keep a strong eye on the environmental aspect of this, right? One term, a couple of terms I do want to get out of the way here, just so everybody's on the same page, is this term resource versus reserve. I think that's really important because I'm going to refer to these terms, and I hope I don't mix them up. So what I've done here is I've plotted these in this little two-dimensional space. So this two-dimensional space is simple. Down here, in the bottom left of the square, is least known. We don't really know where. So let's just say we're talking about oil, okay? Least known. We're not sure that it's there. Best known, we know exactly where it is. It's mapped. We know how deep it is. Across the top, we've got least economic, right? In other words, it's too expensive to get that oil out, or we don't have the technology to get it out. Over here, we have most economic. Show me the money. We can get it out of the ground, and we can refine it and sell it to market and make a profit. Does that make sense? So we're just looking at a particular commodity like oil in this two-dimensional space. Do we know where it is or not? Can we make money off it or can we not? Anything that plots up here in the top right-hand corner is known as a reserve, right? i.e., it's economically profitable to bring it to market, okay? If the price of oil went to $10 a barrel, okay, a whole bunch of oil in the world would shift from here straight across to here. We may know where it is, but it's not economically viable to get it out of the ground, if that makes sense. If that's the case, it's called a resource, okay? Now, I hope I don't make a mistake. I probably will, because I sometimes use these two terms interchangeably, but we're not. Resource means it may become a reserve, right? If something changes, if the price changes or the technology changes. Here's an example. Somewhere over here, once upon a time, okay, was a particular deposit under our feet in Fort Worth called the Barnett Shale, right? Shale is a geologic formation, and it's where it contains oil and gas in very, very, very tiny pore spaces. You can't put a straw down there and suck it out. You can't drill it, okay? It sits under us at about 7,500 feet, and we've known it's been there for a while, but we didn't have the technology to get it out until a technology is developed called horizontal drilling and fracking, where you can go down, blast it, and let the gas come up to the surface. Bazinga. That suddenly moves across here to becoming a reserve, right? And we can sell it and put it to market. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Well, I got 2 slides into energy. Woohoo! That's probably not enough, but that'll set the scene for now. Any thoughts or comments?
I just have a quick question on this.
Fire away, Courtney.
Just to simplify, my